So I am presenting on motivation and reading comprehension with the use of a program or an approach called the Overview of Concept-Oriented Reading Instruction, known as CORI. So the reason I kind of became excited about this topic was actually back in another class when we had the article by Cambria and Guthrie dealing with motivation and reading instruction, entitled Motivating and Engaging Students in Reading. And this was, I knew this intuitively. I think we all do as teachers, how important motivation is when it's tied to student success. But this was just kind of in print and was able to see the importance of those 3 reading motivation factors of interest, dedication, and confidence, and to have the actual data and information that started on this that shows those positive effects when students are able to integrate those 3 elements involved in reading motivation. Because an interested student reads because he enjoys it, a dedicated student reads because he believes it is important, and a confident student reads because he can do it. And this is one of the reasons that, this program and this approach is so important overall, just speaking of what we're learning, whether we're in this for a master's or certification, to understand how important solid reading instruction is to help students build that confidence because they become successful. Because as their reading skills grow or increase, then their confidence increases. And from that same article, they cited the importance of that belief in ourselves. That is the most closely linked to achievement. And so, and I've seen this over the years that I've worked, that I can have a fantastic approach, but if the student doesn't believe they can do it, their motivation is dropped and they're not successful. And so I'm just fascinated by motivation, how that can be supported, what strategies can be used to increase that, and tie that in to see those end results of increased reading comprehension. So one of the pieces is effective skill instruction, because skill instruction and skill acquisition do lead to more motivated readers. One of the articles said skill and will go together. I love that students who are gaining in skill are actually gaining in motivation. And motivated readers will simply read more, which of course we know about the Matthew effect, and students who read more are going to move to that positive side of the Matthew effect in reading. Their advantages are going to increase because they're going to read more. So this is something that's really important when we think about our instruction. So in all of the research, there was kind of this simple connection where motivation, which was intricately tied to student engagement. It's a result largely of student engagement, which is affected by the teacher's approach. That's really important. In connection with strategies in reading comprehension or reading strategies in general, those 2 together yield positive effects in reading comprehension. So this does fit into the larger body of research on reading comprehension and how we can improve that for students. So there, in this research, coming back to that starting point, so specifically in the studies done by Guthrie, McRae, and Claude, they did 11 experiments with 75 statistical comparisons of experimental and control groups. And in those studies, there were 5 motivational practices that were consistent and seen and identified to improve this in students. And these were success, and I'm going to talk about all these a little bit later, thematic units, choice, relevance, and collaboration. And those help motivate for long-term achievement for students. So based on their findings there, they actually developed the program or the approach called concept-oriented reading instruction. So this is focused specifically on grades 3 to 5, but there are studies being done in middle school, and so far the results have been positive there as well. So this approach, concept-oriented reading instruction, or CORI, is designed to teach children comprehension through actually the integration of science and reading. And there is some also collaborating with reading and like history or social studies. The research has shown that many children actually prefer nonfiction books. In fact, one of the articles that we read in this class off of Reading Rockets, Building World Knowledge, Motivating Children to Read and Enjoy Informational Text, cited that. And that actually in one of the studies that I read later on, looking at how, creating that situational increase in engagement can go to long-term effect for overall motivation, found that actually, as students read nonfiction books, their intrinsic motivation to do so increases greatly and affects their overall desire to read. So that's another important reason why, using informational text will be important in our instruction. And that's a key piece of Corey. Another key piece of Corey is building content knowledge, and that increases comprehension skills. We know that. We know the importance of background knowledge. We've studied that in the program, and reading informational text actually is going to build that, which is going to further increase their comprehension skills, particularly when we're dealing with thematic units. So some of the components involved in Corey that I'll go into a little bit more later on are hands-on activities. There's a variety of informational books and choice of subtopics, and those informational books are going to be at appropriate levels for students. That's going to be important. It's going to be focused on concept learning, and there's going to be a lot of frequent reading. They're actually going to read quite a bit of text, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So in my research, of course, I started with a couple of the articles from this class, a couple articles from past classes, and then I went on ERIC and found 4 key articles that I read, 3 specific studies that were tied to the approach to Corey that was used, and those studies help support specific areas in the way that this approach is used. So the first study was grade 4. This was a large sample size. There were 9 Corey teachers that had been trained in that approach, 11 strategy instruction that was a little bit different, and then there was 3 traditional instruction teachers. So there was a pre-test, post-test design. There were several tests given, looking at comprehension, looking at motivation, using questionnaires, different things like that. And then the results, basically just kind of a quick overview. Finding number 1, reading comprehension and reading engagement were correlated. So this study was specifically looking at reading engagement, which they know and identified is motivation as a piece of that, particularly intrinsic motivation. Finding number 2, students experiencing Corey had higher reading comprehension, reading strategy use, and reading engagement than the students in the other groups. And finding 3 was actually the most interesting. So as they observed, when students displayed engagement during the actual instruction of the strategies being taught, then it yielded those increase in comprehension scores. But if students were actually not engaged during instruction, then those results were, they didn't see an increase in comprehension, which makes sense. But that's key to know that engagement is not only in their activities or in the actual reading, but the engagement needs to be there in the actual strategy instruction to see those positive results show up in their comprehension. The second study was 3 4-grade classrooms. Two classes used Corey, and one class used traditional instruction. So there were 4 focal students identified in each class. Now, the reason this had to be such a small sample size is because they used an observational method. They covered 4 dimensions of engagement, looking at affective engagement, behavioral, and cognitive and social. And they had specific scales that they used, pretty close to like a Likert scale, and they were identifying that through observation. They did also assess after reading strategy use and comprehension outcomes. So the results there were 2 classes using Corey showed growth, and the class using traditional instruction did not. They also found in this study that those when there was a high complexity of literacy tasks, which of course were more connected to Corey, there was an increased engagement level for students, and that happened in the classes 1 and 2, which of course were tied to, those were the ones that had the Corey instruction. So study 3, this study looked at whether increases in situational motivation will lead to increases in generalized intrinsic motivation for reading. So this one was key. So this was grade 3. This was over 7 classrooms. There was reported an overall interest in books at first, looking at, which one do they like, informational books or narrative books, and they divided them in those 2 groups. Then during this time, they had to do there was a few things to see this throughout the process or assess it. They used a reading interest log, motivation for reading questionnaire, and then reading comprehension assessment. They used the Gates-McGinnity, which actually the Gates-McGinnity was used for reading comprehension in all of the studies that I looked at. So situational motivation. So here's some of the results. So situational motivations for choosing information books. I should explain a little bit about situational motivation. So situational motivation is tied to a specific experience, a positive experience with a book that someone likes. Maybe it's connected to what was happening as they read that book. So there's motivation tied to that. And so it's about tapping into that excitement and engagement and increasing it with a similar experience to see if we can get that to transfer. And so that's coming through themes and connected topics. There were a lot of approaches there. So some of the things that were found is situational motivations for choosing information books actually became more intrinsic over time. So I should have mentioned that they were actually looking at the different types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. And they also separated in this study comprehension strategies from motivation, because a lot of times it's hard to tell if it's motivation or that skill instruction. And this study was awesome because it actually had assessment at the end that separated that and looked which ones were tied specifically to motivation or were dependent upon those strategies. And then students who chose narrative books actually became less extrinsically motivated in their reasons for reading. So one of the reasons that they kind of concluded that why that happened is because the students who were in Corey and using those informational textbooks, their competence, because of the approach in Corey, their competence to choose, read, and learn from informational text actually increased, which is why that intrinsic motivation increased. So those overall shifts transferred from situational to general motivation, and that was really powerful there. So now this last study wasn't using the Corey approach. It was specific to motivation and inference. This was actually undergraduate students, so this was adult learners. The reason that this study was kind of the motivation behind it, is this key piece that we know that inference actually requires a lot of effort on the part of the reader. And so motivation may prompt the reader to actually exert that effort. And so this was specifically looking at, again, that separation of, this one also separated that reading comprehension skill and motivation. And that was a really powerful piece of this one as well. So this reading comprehension skill was actually positively associated with inference generation and reading motivation. That was the key, finding. We know that there's a positive correlation there. Intrinsic motivation was actually positively associated with text connecting inference generation. But reading efficacy was not correlated directly with motivation. It was actually dependent upon reading comprehension skill, which is why it's so important that we have skill instruction in connection with these motivation supports and strategies. Extrinsic motivation was positively correlated to reading comprehension when connected to reading for a goal. In several of the articles that we have read, it talks about how having a purpose does affect a positive result for reading comprehension, and this was just another support of that, but identifying that difference around that extrinsic motivation piece. And then finally, effective reading instruction may increase motivation. So we know that, we saw that in a couple, so it's really important that we have both the motivational piece and effective reading strategy instruction as well. So what does all this mean? You may be feeling a little like this right now, a little unmotivated to listen any longer. A lot of that research is hard to get through, and we don't want our students to feel like that, right? And actually, this was really an exciting exciting study for me because the results were so positive. That the motivation can really be a key factor in student success, that our students won't feel like that. But all the studies involving Corey just had, great results, and we saw a big difference there. And that was as opposed to those traditional instructional methods, a lot of those using basals and just those that we see in the classrooms. And so even though this is not used a ton, this approach definitely proves the need for a move in this direction. So let's talk a little bit about Corey, the purpose behind it. So there are three main purposes: increasing reading comprehension, increasing students' knowledge of life science, and increasing students' motivation to read overall. So in a lot of the research that brought this in, there were 5 teacher practices identified that optimize student engagement in reading. So first, an emphasis on learning and knowledge goals. So that came in from a lot of the research that I've already talked about. Provision of real-world interactions connected to reading topics. Comprehension strategy instruction using interesting information and literary text. That came from several of those studies as well. And support for student autonomy and support for student collaboration. So we need both of those. One of the things that I love about this approach is the things that are identified that work. Teacher practices and motivation strategies can be used outside of this specific approach. They can be used in our classroom and what we're doing to help build and increase comprehension, and to see those positive results. And that was really exciting for me because the program is powerful, but these things can be taken outside of that program and be used to help us create a positive effect for our students. So the approach, it's conceptual knowledge. That's what they're working on. It's explicit reading strategies tied to big ideas. A lot of that's done through hands-on activities because we know active learning is motivating. There's a variety of informational books at appropriate levels. Students get to choose, this is coming back to that motivational piece of choice, they get to choose the subtopics and texts. And they do frequent reading, 30 to 40 books over 12 weeks. So that's one of the difficulties or challenges in this approach, is there you have to have access. They say it takes a long time to implement this because you've got to take time to find and develop that library of those books. And we'll talk about, there were certain numbers they recommended of trade books versus novels and poems as well. This ran about the daily instruction for about 60 to 90 minutes during the language arts period is how it was used. So some of the cognitive processes that are used in this approach. First is observation. Students observe natural and scientific phenomena in their neighborhood. We want to make that connection for them. And so students actually generate their own questions about what's going on in their environment, and they're going to find those answers through their reading. So this is going to tie back into relevance for students. And then they do a lot of in-depth reading. Students delve deep into investigating their scientific topic via books. Reading lots of books is valuable for comprehension, and that's one of the key goals, remember, or purposes of Corey. Then there's collaboration. Students are going to collaborate with each other to understand what the books say, and they're going to share their ideas, and that's going to expand their learning as well. And then writing and communication. Children will work to understand the topics through reading activities, and they're going to share their understanding with others in class through writing and through presentations. Now, there are specific reading strategies explicitly taught in Corey, because we know that connection, that's part of it in connection with those motivational strategies. With specific approaches connecting into student engagement, there also has to be reading strategy instruction. Some of those that are covered are background knowledge, questioning, searching, summarizing, organizing graphically, and structuring stories. So there are 5 segments within the daily lesson. It starts with 10 minutes of oral reading fluency activities with poems or information books. Now, 2 days of the week, instead of oral reading fluency, students actually study science concepts with hands-on activities. Then there's a 10-minute mini lesson on comprehension. So remember, there's 6 areas covered on comprehension. I mentioned them quickly just now. So they teach 1 a week, and then for the first 6 weeks, and then the last 6 weeks, because this whole approach runs about 12 weeks, then those are combined and used in correlation with each other. And then the last part of the lesson, the last 3 segments are actually 3 15-minute segments of small group guided reading, so applying those comprehension strategies. And this is where differentiation can happen. This will be key for leveling your groups to help provide supports there that are needed and make sure they're getting text at appropriate levels. And then those groups would be worked with and with the teacher, and that piece will be important. And then another rotation would be writing. They're going to be doing entries in student portfolios, and connecting their literature with those hands-on activities and the concepts that they're studying in science. And then the third one is independent reading, where the book club novels are read. So the materials needed that they suggested are information books, novels, and poetry. Tend to be quite more extensive number of informational books they needed. Trade books are the key thing, and then some novels and poetry for some of those additional groups. So some of the adaptations that they mentioned for struggling readers. So small group instruction, that's already being differentiated, and that can be targeted within that small group instruction. Emphasis on oral reading fluency and expressiveness. They suggested a reader's theater approach. Simplified strategy instruction, that can happen within those groups. During that time, that's where the scaffolding can happen, and opportunities to learn reading strategies is needed, and text difficulty is matched to students' reading level. So to finish up, one of the key takeaways I think that for me and that I wanted to share with you is these motivational practices, these 5 motivational practices that we can do in any approach that are going to help students, and we know from the studies it has a positive correlation with their reading comprehension. So the first one is success. We want to make sure that the texts are reader friendly, that students can read a text aloud with 90% accuracy. Success is the royal road to confidence, as Cambria and Guthrie talked about. We want to make sure that students, can be challenged and have the supports they need, but we want them to be successful, and that's going to happen through what they're reading, and that they have really solid, engaging, explicit instruction and necessary strategies. Thematic units is the second one. This is a powerful tool for developing students' confidence. The thematic units can be literary, topical, or discipline-based. A thematic unit across time has the benefit of nurturing students' confidence in reading, because when the students see the topics and key questions and essential portions of the text that are linked together, they gain a sense that they can read that, they can activate that, and be successful there. So the third one is choice. We know how important that is. It's actually a favorite motivator of many teachers. Giving students choice within their practice and what they're reading is going to be key. We know that that's a motivational piece for students and a simple thing for us to do as teachers. And then the fourth one is relevance. Teachers practicing the art of relevance enable students to connect the books of instruction to their lives. So for an example, in this approach with Corey, an example of one hands-on activity is they actually had students dissect an owl pellet. And so the students got all excited. They were so excited when they saw, the bones within that pellet, and they put them together and realized, inferred that it was a mouse. And after about that 20-minute experience, students read avidly for 5 to 10 days about how animals live, find food, and defend themselves from predators. Providing that owl pellet experience is providing relevance for reading. Those hands-on activities are powerful, and they even use a couple examples. Not only is this sometimes connected to science, but this approach is used with social studies or history as well, with some great success there. And then the last one is collaboration. This is key because the social relationships are paramount for students' developments as readers. This, we can provide through partner reading, team summarizing, group posters, peer conferencing, and that was a key piece of this approach as well. And both primary and intermediate levels research supports the power of motivational and emotional support for building motivation. A nationwide observational study of primary classrooms showed that when teachers were sensitive to students' interests, invited student input into classroom decisions, and avoided harsh criticism, students gained in reading achievement. And that's powerful. And that's what we want to do, is empower students. And I love that this was broken down between those 5, teacher approaches and these motivational practices. We can have a positive effect on our students that will yield those positive results in their confidence, through their success. We're going to empower them and excite them with learning and help those motivations to carry over generally, which is going to be key, because then we can maybe help shift the dial on that Matthew effect. And then in the end result, we'll see an overall increase in their reading comprehension. And that's the goal. So I hope that some of these might be something that will be beneficial in your instruction. Thank you so much for your time. My resources are listed here, but also on my handout. Thank you again so much.